Iran thought it had everything figured out. Missiles and drones, use them both, and you can hold off the US by causing enough damage to bring an end to Operation Epic Fury. Iran was wrong. While it's using conventional weapons, the US has just started a space war. Technology so futuristic that it shouldn't even exist is obliterating some of Iran's most important weapons, and there's nothing the crumbling Tehran regime can do about it. The US is using satellites to take out Iran's missile launch sites. As much as we'd love to tell you that the US has an impossible space laser that fires on those sites as soon as they're discovered, that isn't the case, at least not yet. But what the US is doing is just as ingenious, and it allows for Iran's launch sites to be detected as soon as they're used and then destroyed within a matter of minutes. Let's set the scene. With so much of its military infrastructure in tatters already, Iran has been reduced to launching missiles from isolated sites. Iran has to be careful. It knows that US fighter jets and bombers are patrolling the skies, so any missile launch has to be conducted from a safe location. And it has to be fast enough to allow Iran to fire, then get its launchers back into cover before a response comes. That should be fine for Iran, as long as its air defense radars give the all clear. It has plenty of time to launch before a US fighter jet comes calling. That's what Iran thinks. But as the launcher is rolled out and the missile is fired, something is happening in the deep depths of space that Iran doesn't realize. In orbit around the Earth are satellites operated by the US Space Force, which was established in 2019 during US President Donald Trump's first term in office. Those satellites are packed with infrared sensors and they're constantly watching. As soon as one of Iran's missiles blasts off, the satellites detect the heat signatures of those missiles. In an instant, the location of the launch and in turn the launcher is pinpointed. Air defenses on the ground are activated so quickly that Iran's missile is destroyed before it has the chance to reach its target. That's bad enough for Iran. Another failed launch isn't what Iran needs now that the US and Israel have shut down the saturation strategy it intended to use. We'll get into in a few moments. But what Iran never accounted for is that heat signatures detected in space can lead to missile launchers being destroyed on the ground. As soon as the US satellite picks up on the launcher's location, the data is sent to a fighter jet pilot. When that pilot arrives at the launch site within minutes, a standoff missile is fired. The Iranian soldiers who launched the missile barely even register that the response is coming before the missile hits. The launcher explodes, and one more piece of Iran's missile infrastructure is taken out of the war. This is a type of war that Iran never thought it would have to fight, a technological battle against the United States that has far more tricks up its sleeve than anybody could have expected. And while there are more ways that the US is using space to shatter Iran, which we'll cover soon, the existence of its heat-detecting satellites is perhaps the biggest threat the US poses to Iran's missile-based strategy. The New York Post reports that the process of tracking one of Iran's launches involves both the satellites and special nodes on the ground. As soon as a missile is launched, infrared beams are fired from America's satellites as they automatically track the heat being generated. On the ground, and remarkably enough, almost entirely in the US itself rather than its Middle Eastern bases, crews are working non-stop inside radomes. These special radar domes, which look like giant golf balls buried in the ground, receive the information that the Space Force satellites capture, and they use it to calculate both the trajectories of the fired missiles and the locations from which they are fired. It's an extremely effective combination of technology, and it has resulted in hundreds of Iran's missiles being destroyed before they ever come close to striking their targets. And what the US has here is a three-layered space-focused form of air defense that is unlike anything that the world has seen before. Satellites, radars, and radomes combine to create an early warning system that is so advanced that the US is the first to know about any of Iran's missile launches, and it learns about them practically as soon as Iran decides to fire. And what this also means for the US is that it can avoid putting boots on the ground in Iran until it is absolutely ready, as explained by former Space Force member Bree Fram. The fact that this isn't a mass formation of troops with rifles on the ground speaks to the fact that this force is built with extreme technology and the brain power to operate it, Fram tells the New York Post, adding, "Those combine to make us the most capable force on Earth and keep Americans safe from harm as they do the most difficult, inherently risky things that we ask them to do." What the US has orbiting the Earth right now is the ultimate high ground. Having the high ground has always been an advantage in conventional warfare. It provides visibility across large swathes of the battlefield, as well as a defensible position that forces an enemy to work even harder to take territory. But this new form of high ground changes the game. The US doesn't just have visibility on the territory that surrounds a large hill, it can see all of Iran at all times, thanks to its satellites. And as for Iran having to work harder to take the high ground, that just isn't even an option for Tehran's crumbling regime. It's brought drones and missiles to a space war, and it can't do a thing about the satellites that the US is using to shatter its entire strategy. The impact on Iran tells you all you need to know about the effectiveness of the US space technology. Iran fired more than 500 ballistic missiles at targets throughout the Middle East, including military installations and civilian sites by March 4th, according to the Long War Journal. It would be inaccurate to claim that none of Iran's missiles have hit their marks, but by March 2nd, only 6 US service members have been killed in Iran's attacks, along with 18 being wounded. That low casualty rate tells us the vast majority of Iran's missiles aren't making it through to their targets, and heat-seeking satellites so far up in the sky that they can't be seen are one of the biggest reasons why. On the missile launch front, the BBC reports that the Israel Defense Forces claim that 70% of Iran's ballistic missile launches have been destroyed since the beginning of Operation Epic Fury and Operation Roaring Lion. Many of these sites would have been known about and targeted at the beginning of the operations. But now, as Iran has moved to a strategy of launching small numbers of missiles from isolated sites, the launches that are being taken out are often detected by America's space assets. Every launch that Iran attempts presents a massive risk. Iran sends a massive beacon into the sky with every missile that it fires. We mentioned that Iran has now been restricted to isolated missile launches a moment ago. That's another major problem for Iran's regime. That regime has been preparing for war, most likely with Israel, but perhaps also with the US, for years. Part of that preparation involved the amassing of a ballistic missile stockpile believed to exceed 2,000, per the BBC. Iran's strategy in a war was to saturate the skies of its enemies with ballistic missiles and drones, essentially overwhelming air defenses so that missiles and drones could touch down, cause damage, and basically dissuade an enemy from launching further attacks. The cost of war against Iran was key to the country's military doctrine, and missiles were the linchpin of the entire thing. Iran still has massive missile stockpiles, but as satellites help the US pick off what Iran fires and to destroy the launches being used, the saturation strategy has all but disappeared. Iran is still attempting to make Operation Epic Fury appear to cost more than it's worth. The smaller strikes against US bases in other Gulf nations are in service of Iran's attempting to raise the economic and political costs of the war by dragging those nations kicking and screaming into a fight in which they want no part. But the strategy would also be much stronger for Iran if it were able to unleash its missiles in the volume that it intended before the US brought its satellites into play. Iran now has to stagger launches rather than saturate. We see that in the numbers coming out of the United Arab Emirates, per Al Jazeera. During the first 24 hours of Operation Epic Fury, Iran unleashed 167 cruise and ballistic missiles, along with 541 drones at that age. By day 15 of the conflict, the numbers were down to 4 missiles and 6 drones. We see something similar in Israel, where the 100 or so projectiles Iran launched during the first couple of days of the war have dropped into single digits. Again, Space Force assets aren't the only reason why this happened, but the heat-seeking satellites have played a huge role, forcing Iran to get more strategic with missile strikes that it knows have a high probability of not working because they can be detected at the moment of launch. Technology, then, has been the killer of Iran's desired approach to war, but it goes much deeper than satellites that can detect missile launches. AI and cyber tactics have combined to degrade Iran's entire approach. But before we dig deeper into how, this is a quick reminder that you are watching The Military Show. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time to hit that button. Ahead of the initial hellstorm of missiles and bombs that the US and Israel unleashed on Iran on February 28, a combination of cyber and space activities have been used to degrade Iran's supporting infrastructure. Command and control networks, radars, sensors, and communication systems were all targeted by these non-kinetic efforts, which were made to make it extremely difficult for Iran's regime to coordinate its response to what was happening. All of its leaders were being turned to dust. General Dan Kane, who is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, explained how when he said, "The first movers were US Cybercom and US Spacecom, layering non-kinetic effects, disrupting and degrading and blinding Iran's ability to see, communicate, and respond. From space, the US ripped out Iran's eyes, which only made the military infrastructure that Operation Epic Fury and Operation Roaring Lion have targeted all the more vulnerable. This was the US throwing sand into Iran's eyes before delivering haymaker after haymaker to its jaw." Brent David Ziarnik, who is a retired US Air Force officer and former professor in the US Space Force program at Johns Hopkins University, explains more, telling the New York Post, "Space Force figures out where the radar is, then work with Cyber Command to jam it. Cyber Command will try to make Iran's radar not work. It will involve infiltrating the system and shutting it down or taking it over. The software goes and the computer turns it into a brick." So Iran doesn't just have to worry about the US unleashing its fighter jets as soon as a missile launch site is discovered by Space Force. The radars and computers used to guide the missiles that Iran launches are also being targeted. That's bad enough from the perspective of ballistic missile launches, but it becomes an even more serious problem for Iran when you remember that its air defense systems fire missiles too. An air defense system that can't see is a system that can't stop a US fighter jet or bomber from swooping in and destroying whatever is next on its massive list of targets. This combination of space and cyber warfare is likely the reason why the US and Israel had successfully struck 15,000 targets by March 13th, as claimed by US Secretary of War Pete Hegseth. Around 80% of Iran's defense network has been taken offline, most of it during the first 24 hours of the conflict, and it's now clear that not all of those defenses were destroyed. Space Force detected radars. American and Israeli cyber forces shut those radars down, crippling Iran's air defenses in the process. This was the silent sabotage that laid the foundation for all of the success that the US has experienced during the operation, and it was sabotage conducted not by infiltrators on the ground, but by satellites in orbit. Communications were disrupted and GPS signals were jammed, which has also played a part in Iran's missile-based strategy failing to achieve the results that the regime thought it would. Oh, and what there was of Iran's own space command has also gone the way of the dodo, but we'll come back to that toward the end of the video, so stick with us till then. Before that, let's throw some artificial intelligence into the mix. As if satellites that detect missile launches and radars weren't enough, Iran has also had to deal with the US using AI as it unleashed a technological tidal wave on Tehran. On March 11th, NBC News reported that unnamed sources had told it that the US military had been using AI systems provided by Palantir to help it identify potential targets as it continues to launch strikes on Iran. It's likely that the US has been leveraging the Maven intelligence analysis program, which Palantir built based on Anthropic's Claude AI technology. This is the same system that the US used in its operation to capture former Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, and it allows military personnel to sift through massive amounts of intelligence quickly. Specific targeting advice isn't provided by this system. Instead, it seems to act more like a filter that gets rid of the noise to ensure that the US military is only working with usable intelligence that helps it to pick and choose its targets. CBS News says that the Pentagon is keeping quiet about exactly how it's using AI in Iran, despite Hegseth claiming that he wants to make AI usage central to how the US military operates. However, retired US Navy Admiral and now Senior Director of the Center on Cyber and Technology Innovation at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, Mark Montgomery, reveals how powerful this tech can be. The military is now processing roughly 1,000 potential targets a day and striking the majority of them, with turnaround time for the next strike potentially under 4 hours, Montgomery tells CBS, adding, "A human is still in the loop, but AI is doing the work that used to take days of analysis, and doing it at a scale no previous campaign has matched." Seriously, America. Starting a space war isn't enough. You now have to throw AI capabilities that Iran could only dream of having into Operation Epic Fury too. What we see here is that the US has found a way to identify targets at such high speeds that it can actually match the force that it has brought to the Persian Gulf. Dozens of fighter jets flying from aircraft carriers can now launch sorties around the clock because they have a constant flow of targets coming in due to the US's use of AI. As for Iran, it can't even hope to compete with the US in the space war. Not that it could anyway, but earlier we touched on how the US has destroyed whatever space-related assets that Iran had a long time ago. By March 5th, Iran's Space Command was gone, Defense One reports. While not the most important strike that the US has carried out in Iran, it does mean that Iran can't use the 13 operational satellites, 3 of which were registered to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps that it has launched into space. Iran also appears to have no real anti-satellite capabilities, the same outlet reports. It has used electronic warfare to jam commercial satellite signals in the past, but how that has translated into jamming military GPS signals isn't clear. Iran likely can't do much. The US and Israel wouldn't have hit 15,000 targets and counting if it could. The fact that Iran has no global navigation satellite system of its own also leaves it reliant on the systems developed by others. The Daily Sabah points out that only the US, the European Union, China, and Russia have these kinds of systems, and of those 4, 2 are almost certain not to provide Iran with any help. China might, though it risks the wrath of the US if it does. That leaves Russia, which seems the most likely candidate for providing Iran with the satellite navigation tech that it needs for its missile and drone launches. Russia has also been providing satellite imagery to Iran, the Wall Street Journal reports. However, this is all fairly basic stuff, at least when it comes to the space war that the US has unleashed. Plus, if Putin decides that he wants a little more leverage in his dealings with the US, he could always sell Iran down the river by pulling access, which would leave Iran with practically nothing in space that it can use to harm the US. So where does all of this leave Iran? All its regime can really do now is look to the skies that it no longer controls and then look further into space, where the US has won the satellite war before it really started. Iran's satellites are functionally useless now that its version of Space Command is gone. American satellites are detecting missiles instantly, and Iran is paying the price for them. But Iran can't keep its head in the clouds. On the ground, the US is hitting it just as hard as it ever has, and it snatched away the last thing that was keeping Iran alive. If you want to find out what that was, well, check out our video, which covers the massive blow the US has struck and what it could mean for Iran's economy as the country is bombarded daily in Operation Epic Fury. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to hit subscribe so you never miss a video from the Military Show. And thank you for watching.